don't move, okay? Right, I'm arresting you, okay, due to the fact that Isabella, okay, was found alone and deceased at your home address, okay? So I'm arresting you on suspicion of murder.
That's why I've come down here for the day, so I was going to harm myself into what I've got.
A thug who beat a toddler to death before wheeling her body around in a pram for 4 days has been jailed. 2-year-old Isabella Rose Wielden suffered numerous traumatic injuries.
What are you doing, Bella?
Sorry, take it off.
What are you doing? You gonna play?
She was 2 years old. Small hands, bright eyes. The kind of child who giggled at nothing, who twirled in circles until she was dizzy. She should have had years ahead of her. Birthdays. Laughter. The chance to grow. But she never made it past that summer. Isabella Jonas Wielden endured unimaginable suffering. On June 30th, 2023, investigators uncovered a series of deliberate deceptions and heinous acts committed by those entrusted with her care. What happened inside their house would shake an entire community to its core. A crime so horrifying, so unthinkable, that it would leave even the most hardened investigators at a loss for words. Because the people responsible weren't strangers, and they weren't nameless faces either. This is the story of a community's missed warnings, a mother's betrayal, and a child's unheard cries. The story of Isabella Jonas Wielden begins right here. Before the world knew her name, before the headlines and the courtrooms, before the tragedy, Isabella was just a little girl. She had big brown eyes that lit up whenever she saw something new. Tiny hands that reached out for warmth. A giggle that could break through even the darkest of days. She loved bedtime stories. She never sat still for them, not really. She would roll onto her stomach, then onto her back, her little feet kicking under the blankets as her mother read. Milk before bed, her favorite stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. These were the small comforts of her world. But how much comfort did Isabella truly have? Because outside those small moments, between the bedtime stories and the warm milk, there were things that no child should ever have to endure. Chelsea was 26 years old. A woman who had made mistakes, like anyone. But this was not just another mistake. Chelsea had given birth young. Some said she never quite adjusted to the responsibility. Others believed she tried. That she wanted to be a good mother. But wanting and doing are not the same thing. She had struggled, financially, emotionally. Moved from town to town, seeking stability, but it was always just out of reach. She was lost in the chaos of life. Then, she met Scott Jeff. He seemed like the answer to her prayers, older, wiser, a man who appeared to be the missing piece in her broken puzzle. A man who promised stability and protection. But protection? That's not what Isabella found in him. No one knew much about Scott. He was quiet. Kept to himself. But there was something off. A neighbor once described him as polite, but distant. Another called him cold. A man who smiled at all the right moments, but the smile never quite reached his eyes. It started with small things. Quiet moments that felt off. Isabella's laughter faded. She became quieter, her playful nature slowly disappearing. No one could have known that these were the first signs of something monstrous unfolding right in front of their eyes. Isabella, once full of life, became uncharacteristically quiet. Her mother, Chelsea, saw it, but she didn't stop to question it. A neighbor recalled hearing soft crying in the night. A cashier at the grocery store once noticed a bruise on Isabella's tiny wrist. Just a little mark, easy to explain away. Kids fall, don't they? These were moments people ignored, thinking it was just part of life. But was that the truth? Or were these signs of something much more disturbing? And Chelsea? What did she see? A man she wanted to love. A life she wanted to believe in. A future she thought she was securing for herself. But at what cost? And if someone had stopped just for a moment longer, would Isabella still be alive? Or was this tragedy inevitable? Somewhere along the way, Chelsea made a choice. A choice that no mother should ever make. And Scott? He had made his choice long before that. But what happened inside that house on June 30th was no accident. Have you ever been in a situation where you saw signs of something wrong but didn't act? What made you hesitate? Could you have stopped it? Isabella's fate had already been decided. And soon, the world would find out just how deep the betrayal ran. The tragedy was only just beginning. And when it was over, the question wouldn't be why did this happen? It would be, how did no one stop it? June 26, 2023. A day that began like any other in Ipswich, Suffolk. The sun rose. The birds chirped. But for 2-year-old Isabella Jonas Wilden, it would be her last. The morning seemed ordinary. A quiet neighborhood, a sleepy town. Neighbors went about their daily routines, unaware of the horror that was unfolding just beyond their view. Chelsea and Scott went about their day as if nothing was amiss. They were seen leaving their temporary accommodation, but Isabella, usually the center of attention with her giggles and playful energy, was conspicuously absent. The flat was unnervingly quiet, too quiet. Isabella, a bundle of energy, a toddler full of life, was nowhere to be heard. No laughter. No playful noises. Just silence. The kind of silence that made you pause and wonder what was wrong. Neighbors noted the silence but assumed it was just a lazy summer morning. They had no way of knowing that within those walls, a child was suffering. Chelsea and Scott had recently moved to Ipswich, seeking a fresh start after leaving behind the chaos of their previous lives. But beneath the surface, their relationship was far from stable. They fought. Constantly. Their arguments had become a fixture in the building, a background noise that the neighbors had learned to tune out. But that day, the fight was different. It was louder. More intense. More desperate. The walls of their flat, once a refuge, now held the weight of something darker. The neighbors, too, could feel it. Something was wrong. As the day wore on, the flat became unnaturally quiet. No more arguments, no more sounds. No laughter. No cries, just silence. Was Isabella inside? Or had she already suffered in silence? And if so, who could have heard her cries? One neighbor, Mr. Patel, observed Scott leaving the flat late at night, his demeanor hurried and anxious. Another resident across the street, Mrs. Thompson, noted that the curtains had been drawn for days. No one had seen Isabella. But still, they did nothing. They didn't pry. They didn't ask questions. The community was too busy to notice, cloaked in a veil of normalcy. Why didn't anyone act? Was it fear? Indifference? Or was it simply that people didn't want to believe what they were seeing? Meanwhile, Chelsea and Scott continued with their charade. The lies they wove grew more intricate, more seamless. They appeared normal, too normal. Like any young couple living their life. But there was something off about them, a disconnect between their calm demeanor and the truth that was slowly emerging. If you had seen the signs, would you have acted? Or would you have stayed silent, just like the neighbors? In the days following Isabella's disappearance, Chelsea and Scott maintained a facade of normality. CCTV footage from a local convenience store showed Chelsea and Scott shopping together. Their movements were unnervingly calm. The items they bought were mundane: milk, bread, bin liners. But Scott's right arm, wrapped in a makeshift sling, caught the attention of investigators later. Was it an accident, or was there more to his injury than met the eye? On the surface, everything seemed normal. But beneath it all, something was terribly wrong. Isabella was gone. But Chelsea and Scott didn't seem to care. They were about to make their biggest mistake. But as the investigation continued, the truth began to leak through the cracks. The inconsistencies in Chelsea and Scott's stories only deepened the mystery. Chelsea claimed that Isabella had been unwell, that a sudden illness had taken her life. But the evidence told a different story. Scott, on the other hand, suggested an accidental fall, blaming Isabella's playful nature. These two stories, contradictory and inconsistent, only raised more questions. But the most shocking revelation came when CCTV footage surfaced. The footage showed Chelsea and Scott pushing a stroller through the streets of Ipswich. But there was no child playing inside. Instead, Isabella's cold and lifeless body lay beneath the blankets, hidden from view. For days, they had paraded her body through town, fooling the world into thinking everything was fine. They maintained a facade so convincing that no one thought to ask why a 2-year-old child wasn't seen. Why didn't they call for help? Why didn't they stop the charade? Were they so far gone, so consumed by their own lies, that they couldn't face the truth? Or was it something more forbidden, something that would only be revealed when the investigation reached its inevitable conclusion? When police finally intervened, the truth came rushing to the surface. Isabella's body had been concealed, hidden from the world, but the truth was beginning to surface. And the deeper the investigation went, the more it became clear. Isabella had suffered brutal injuries, fractures that had been inflicted over time at the hands of those who were supposed to love and protect her. Abuse had gone on for months, and the community had missed it. But the signs were there. The question, then, was simple: how could the signs of abuse have been ignored for so long? The investigation had only just begun, but the pieces were starting to fit together. The lies, the manipulation, the chilling facade, how much longer would it take before the truth was fully revealed? Who was responsible for the final blow? Was it Scott? Or was it Chelsea? The truth was about to come out, but would it be enough? For 4 days, Chelsea Gleason Mitchell and her partner, Scott Jeff, played a twisted game of pretend. They pretended everything was fine. They pretended their home was safe, and that the child they had once loved still lived. But behind the closed doors of that flat in Ipswich, the truth had already begun to unravel. Then, the call came. It wasn't Chelsea. It wasn't Scott. On June 30th, 2023, a call to emergency services shattered the facade of normalcy that had enveloped Isabella Jonas Wilden's life. A concerned friend, Joanne Gardner, had been confided in by Chelsea Gleason Mitchell and, with a heavy heart, reached out to authorities. She revealed the unthinkable: Isabella was dead, and her body had been concealed in a stroller within their temporary accommodation in Ipswich. Chelsea herself admitted that Isabella was dead. But instead of acting immediately, the pair waited. They waited for days, allowing their lies to marinate in the silence. The bruises on Isabella's small body were too much to ignore. They couldn't afford to call for help, not with the marks that painted a horrifying picture. Scott was worried. He knew that the authorities would question how Isabella had died, and the answers they could offer wouldn't hold up. Chelsea's voice faltered on the other end of the line. She didn't need to say much more. The truth spilled out. How they had concealed Isabella's body, how they had pushed her lifeless form through the streets, hiding behind the charade of normalcy. But why confess now? What had finally driven Chelsea to admit the unthinkable? Was it guilt eating away at her? Was it fear that the walls of their deception were about to collapse? And so, it began. Chelsea and her partner, Scott Jeff, were not at home when the authorities arrived. They had fled, attempting to evade capture, as the horror they had created began to unfold. The police were left to piece together the truth, and the couple's disappearance added yet another layer of mystery to the unfolding tragedy. At 1:07 p.m., paramedics arrived. The flat was eerily silent, and the scene inside was far from what anyone could have imagined. Isabella's lifeless body was found in the bathroom, partially hidden by blankets and a stroller. The one that had been wheeled through the streets, concealing the lifeless body of a child. As they lifted the blankets, there was no mistaking the truth that had been buried. The body of Isabella Jonas Wilden, 2 years old, cold to the touch, her tiny hands stiff with rigor mortis. Her lips, once pink, were now blue. She wasn't sleeping. She wasn't resting peacefully. She was gone. The couple's absence added to the weight of suspicion. How could they not be there? Where had they gone? What were they running from? The autopsy provided the heartbreaking confirmation of what the investigators had feared. Isabella had not passed away peacefully in her sleep, as Chelsea had claimed. Instead, her tiny body had suffered repeated trauma, multiple fractures to her wrist, ribs, and pelvis. The cause of death was determined to be a bone marrow embolism, resulting from ongoing abuse. The severity of her injuries painted a picture of a child who had been tortured, a child who had been failed by the very people entrusted to protect her. As the investigation continued, the authorities began to close in on Scott and Chelsea. With the truth now exposed, one question remained: will Scott Jeff and Chelsea Gleason Mitchell face the justice they so desperately tried to hide from? Could they escape the consequences of their actions? How could this happen? What made Chelsea and Scott commit such a heinous crime against a defenseless child? In the case of Isabella Jonas Wilden, one question remains at the forefront of the tragedy: why did Chelsea Gleason Mitchell, a mother, allow her daughter to be treated so cruelly by Scott Jeff? What led her to ignore the signs? What caused her to become complicit, to remain silent in the face of violence that ultimately claimed her child's life? To understand why Chelsea allowed this abuse to continue, we must look into her past. What made her so vulnerable to Scott's manipulation, and why couldn't she protect her own child? It's important to note that there's no single answer to this question. There's no clear-cut explanation for why someone like Chelsea, who loved her daughter, could allow such maltreatment to occur. The truth, as it often does, lies somewhere in the complexity of her situation, the dynamics of her relationships, and the psychological toll she may have been under. One factor that may have played a role is financial dependence. Chelsea, like many in similar situations, may have found herself relying on Scott financially. The pressure of meeting basic needs, housing, food, and a stable environment as a young mother can create a dynamic where someone feels trapped. It's possible that, despite her suspicions and fears about Scott's behavior, Chelsea was unable to break free from the relationship due to a lack of financial independence. In these circumstances, emotional dependency can often follow. Chelsea may have felt that she had no choice but to endure Scott's mistreatment, either because she was emotionally invested in the relationship or because she had nowhere else to go. Perhaps she believed that the relationship, despite its faults, was worth maintaining because it provided her with something she felt she needed: companionship, security, or even love. Chelsea may have been emotionally manipulated by Scott. Abusers often use manipulation tactics to control their victims, gradually eroding their sense of self-worth. This can make it difficult for a victim to see what's happening, as their reality becomes clouded by the abuser's influence. Over time, emotional abuse can become so normalized that a victim may fail to recognize the severity of the situation until it's too late. But there may have been other factors at play as well. Chelsea may have experienced her own history of trauma, which could have shaped her ability to make decisions in high-stress situations. It's possible that her background, whether it involved previous abuse, neglect, or emotional hardship, had an impact on her ability to act in Isabella's defense. Was she repeating patterns of behavior she had learned in her own upbringing? Could she have believed, on some level, that this treatment was normal? Then there's the possibility of psychological factors that may have influenced Chelsea's actions, or inaction. Maybe she suffers from depression, anxiety, or some other condition that clouded her judgment and made it difficult for her to act. Could she have been so overwhelmed by her own emotional state that she couldn't see the severity of the situation? It's important to consider that mental health struggles can sometimes cause a person to rationalize, minimize, or ignore unhealthy behavior, especially if they're in a toxic relationship or dealing with their own trauma. Whatever the reasons, the tragedy of Isabella's death is one that will forever haunt Chelsea. The unanswered question remains, why did she allow this to happen? Was it fear? Dependence? A failure to recognize the signs? Or was it something else, something more complex, that led to this irreversible act? Do you think Chelsea was simply a victim of her circumstances? Or did she make a conscious choice to ignore the abuse happening right under her nose? Scott Jeff. The name rings through this case like a haunting echo. A man who, by all accounts, was supposed to care for Isabella, to protect her. Instead, he was the opposite. What was it that drove him to treat a defenseless 2-year-old so cruelly? Scott Jeff, unlike Chelsea, was not a product of emotional instability in the same way, but he was a man shaped by his own demons. His past was shadowed by anger, control, and possibly unresolved trauma. He had no known history of violence before his relationship with Chelsea, but the people around him, including neighbors and acquaintances, described him as distant and cold. They noticed the lack of warmth in his smile, the emptiness in his eyes. But what made him lash out at Isabella? Was it jealousy of the bond between Chelsea and her daughter? Did Scott resent Isabella for taking her mother's attention? Was his need to control Chelsea so overpowering that he began to take it out on the child? Scott's behavior toward Isabella, at least from his own perspective, may have been one of control. Children, especially vulnerable toddlers, are completely dependent on the adults in their lives. For Scott, Isabella represented something he could dominate, something he could break down. His cruelty toward her was likely a result of the emotional and psychological power he felt he had over her, an innocent child who could not defend herself. Was Scott's behavior fueled by his own trauma? Was he repeating patterns of violence he had learned in his past? Or was it simply his need to exert power over those weaker than him that led him to take such drastic and brutal actions? Do you believe Scott's cruelty was the result of a dark past or a need to assert power over others? What made Scott snap? Was he born with this darkness inside him, or did life's hardships twist him into something monstrous? The truth has a way of revealing itself. No matter how deeply it's buried, no matter how many lies try to smother it, it always finds its way to the surface. Chelsea and her partner were arrested, and inside an interrogation room in Ipswich, Suffolk, the truth was about to do just that. Scott Jeff sat across from the detectives. Hands folded. Unmoving. His expression? Indifferent. Not anxious. Not remorseful. Just waiting. What he didn't know was that they were waiting too. But not for his words. For his lies. Scott's version of events was rehearsed. Mechanical. Emotionless. He claimed that Isabella was sick and she left her in her mother's care. But detectives had heard it all before. And this time, they weren't buying it. They presented him with the autopsy report. The fractures. The blunt force trauma. The internal bleeding. Scott still persisted that he didn't know what happened, but the bruises is as a result of Isabella's playful nature. That was his first mistake, because his search history told a very different story. In the days following Isabella's death, Scott Jeff conducted several internet searches that raised alarming questions. His phone history showed queries like flight to Scotland price, train to Amsterdam, and do you need a passport to Amsterdam? These searches revealed a desperate attempt to escape from the consequences of his actions. Escape from the truth. Then came the CCTV footage. Scott, was seen at a local hardware store buying cleaning supplies. Duct tape. Trash bags, items used to conceal, to cover up. Then came Chelsea. Was she a victim? A terrified mother trapped with an abuser? Or was she something else? Her answers were careful. Measured. She insisted she hadn't known. That she had trusted Scott. That she never laid a hand on her daughter. But then, another search history. How long does it take for a child's body to decompose? Was it panic? Or premeditation? Did she stay silent out of fear, or convenience? And the hardest question of all, if Chelsea had picked up that phone sooner, would Isabella still be alive? The story of Isabella Jonas Wilden did not end when the verdict was read. It never truly ends. Because of the impact, the ripple effect, it extends far beyond the courtroom, beyond the jail cells. What happens after the headlines fade? After the cameras stop rolling? Who is left to deal with the aftermath? In the days and weeks that followed, both the biological father and the grandparents struggled to make sense of Isabella's death. They clung to memories of her laughter, of her small hands reaching out to them, but those memories became bittersweet reminders of all they had lost. And as they mourned, one question remained unanswered: why had this happened? But did they miss something? Could they have stepped in sooner? Was there something they could have done to protect her? And the guilt that lingered, was it theirs to carry? Or had they too been blindsided by the same manipulation Chelsea had fallen for? In the public eye, Isabella's case became one of those stories that stopped everyone in their tracks. A child, just 2 years old, was stolen from the world. News outlets played her story on repeat. Her innocent face, her tiny hands, flashed across every screen. The case captivated the nation. People demanded justice, but did anything change? Was the system held accountable? Months passed. The media moved on, and Isabella's name faded. Will the system ever change? Or is she just another forgotten statistic? As with all tragedies, the signs were there. Social workers visited. Teachers noticed changes. But no one acted. Why? Could one phone call, one intervention, have made a difference? Why didn't someone speak up sooner? The system failed her. The people who could have stepped in failed her. And now, it's too late. Isabella's family is forever changed. Her father will live with the guilt of not being there. Her grandparents will carry the weight of their helplessness. And Chelsea? She will live with the knowledge that she stood by while her daughter suffered. The damage caused by Isabella's death will never heal. The grief? It will never fade. And as we reflect on Isabella's story, we ask ourselves, could she have been saved? Was there more that could have been done to protect her? Was the system blind to the signs? How many more children are out there? How many more are silently suffering, their voices unheard? And what will it take to see the signs before it's too late? The answers may never come, but one thing is certain. Isabella's death must be remembered. We must push for change. We cannot let her story fade away. As we close Isabella's story, we ask you, how often do we let the voices of the most vulnerable fade into silence? Is this just another tragedy? Or a call to action? A wake-up call that demands we do better? What could have been done to save Isabella? What should we do now to protect those who can't protect themselves? We want to hear from you. Was justice served? Could more have been done? Share this video. Share Isabella's story. Let's make sure her voice is never silenced again. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe for more true crime stories, and join the conversation. Together, we can make a difference.